Everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Michael Helme, and I'm the lead volunteer of New Yorkers for Cool Refrigerant Management. One of the aims of our group is to help people understand the issues around refrigerants. And the biggest boost we ever got was when Christina Starr joined our meetings. She's Senior Policy Advisor for the Environmental Investigation Agency with a focus on refrigerants. And she's always been very generous at answering questions, finding resources for us, and also being a friendly supporter of our work. And also presenting with us this evening is Tilden Chao, who I first had communication with when he was a senior in high school in Ithaca, New York. And at that time, he did his senior project on refrigerants. He has since moved on to bigger and better things. As a junior at Yale University this year, he founded the Yale Refrigerants Initiative. It's truly refreshing working with Tilden, and I'm sure you'll all be impressed with what he has to say tonight. And with that introduction, why don't we begin? Christina, we're turning the floor over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael, for kicking us off, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'm going to give us a brief, fascinating and terrifying overview and introduction into the super pollutants that are really all around us in our daily lives and that many of us may not know about. And these are the man-made fluorinated chemicals that have very powerful global warming potentials, per molecule, thousands of times more potent in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And these include the legacy ozone depleting refrigerants, the CFCs and the HCFCs, as well as the current generation of chemicals, hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs. And about 80% of these refrigerants are used as, these chemicals are produced for use as refrigerants. So the vast majority are found in our air conditioners, our refrigerators, our supermarkets, and even in our cars. And the remaining 20% or so are used in insulating foams and different kinds of foams in buildings and other uses, as well as aerosols and fire suppression. So we have a great opportunity here with these gases to prevent about 0.5 degrees Celsius of warming in this century. These are short-lived climate pollutants that typically only have about 15-year lifetime in the atmosphere. And so if we can mitigate these gases now, we can quickly prevent warming. And fortunately, we have a global agreement under the Montreal Protocol to begin doing so. Most recently, however, the UN IPCC, the scientific body that evaluates how we're doing on our climate targets, has warned us that we must even accelerate the Kigali Amendment, the Global Montreal Protocol Agreement, if we are hoping to stay on a path to keep warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. And so the two key areas for action on these gases, when we think about it, is really stopping new production and new use, which means transitioning to other alternative technologies, and preventing the emissions of the gases from existing equipment, whether it's leaking out of equipment while it's being used or when it's being disposed of at end of life. And that'll be a big focus of what we'll talk about today. Next slide. And another big point I want to make introducing these gases is that over the decades since they were introduced, we've really been stuck on this forever loop of fluorinated chemicals. It started with the CFCs, which were ozone depleting substances. They were also extremely potent greenhouse gases. We transitioned out of those, although many are still around, to HCFCs and now HFCs. And here we are now introducing yet another generation of synthetic chemicals called hydrofluoroolefins, which are the chemical industry's latest generation of synthetic molecules that are being promoted as refrigerants. And although HFOs have much lower global warming potentials, they often are mixed with HFCs to be refrigerants and still have, when mixed together, pretty potent global warming potentials. And there are also other potential effects to think about. So production processes of HFOs can cause harmful toxic byproducts, as well as still using HFCs as a feedstock molecule to make the HFO, which can also contribute to ongoing HFC emissions. One of the most potent HFCs known to man is HFC 23, which actually is very much used as a refrigerant, but is a byproduct, a somewhat useless byproduct of producing HCFCs and HFCs. Another potential ecological crisis in the future could come from these HFOs breaking down in the atmosphere into forever chemicals, trifluoroacetic acid, or TFA, being within the category of PFAS, which some may know from other types of fluorinated chemicals that are produced as being quite toxic and potentially damaging to human health. So these are all things we should be thinking about. And the really big takeaway from this is that we can get off this chemical treadmill. And part of the way to do that is to focus on introducing the natural refrigerants like carbon dioxide, hydrocarbons, and ammonia. We can also encourage development of non-refrigerant technologies that don't rely on any kind of refrigerant. And one example of that is magnetic cooling. And there are several others that none of which are fully commercialized for a range of uses yet, but are being explored. And then the third thing is, if we are using HFOs, really to think about how can we limit their use and ensure environmental justice in their production. And you can see here two of these major companies, most well-known chemical companies producing HFCs here in the United States and around the world are Honeywell and Chemours. So something for everyone to be aware of. Next slide. So just to give a brief run through of all the different policies and regulations that are in place and still being put in place on HFCs. At the global level, we have in 2016, we reached an agreement at the Montreal Protocol known as the Kigali Amendment, where countries came together and agreed to a united schedule and timeline for phasing down HFCs. Now, the one shortcoming of this agreement is that the Montreal Protocol does not yet address the ongoing emissions of these chemicals from existing sources. And it's a phase down and not ultimately not a phase out. And so we still expect to see some use and emissions of HFCs under this agreement. Here in the United States, we have had the Clean Air Act controls on refrigerants over the years. And unfortunately, those controls have limited the EPA and what they can do in some cases due to legal interpretation of those rules. And they've really focused mostly on ozone depleting substances. The two areas to be aware of are the SNAP program, which basically will approve a given chemical refrigerant for a certain use. And the other one being the Section 608 Refrigerant Management Program, which has set the framework for how we limit the leaking of ozone depleting substances, but unfortunately still does not control or prevent leaks of HFCs. It also prevents the illegal venting of refrigerants, or prohibits it, but doesn't prevent it, I should say. And then most importantly to know about is the new legislation passed in 2020 as part of one of the COVID stimulus acts. And this legislation is really the groundbreaking piece of climate legislation of the last decade or so. And it puts in place a really good framework for giving a lot more authority to the EPA to begin implementing new regulations to reduce HFCs. So it's still being put into effect. The first regulation has been finalized, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide and what's still to come. Some states are also taking leadership on this area. California and Washington in particular are two to keep a close eye on. California recently finalized regulations that actually ban most HFCs in new supermarket refrigeration systems as of January 1st. You won't see a new supermarket opening in the state that continues using these gases. So it's great progress being made there. Washington is following closely on California's footsteps, and we hope to see New York do the same, as well as our federal government. But these really serve as the bar for where we should be setting policy domestically. It is positive to see New York's scoping plan discussing HFCs as well in quite a bit of detail, but we have yet to see many regulations yet. To go into a bit more detail on the AIM Act and the 3 areas of authority, first, it implements a phase down allowance system. And this has already been finalized by the EPA quite quickly in the past year. And it requires anyone producing or importing HFCs to have an allowance allocated to them by the EPA. And then over time, EPA reduces the amount of allowances available over time, consistent with the schedule for phasing down HFCs until we get to a reduction of about 85% in 2036. So that's been published and put in place. It's already going into effect at the beginning of this year. We're at 90% of what was available in the baseline years. So 90% of the HFCs on the market that were allowed back in 2013 or 2015. So it's already starting. But there's 2 other big areas which I think are really what are going to guide the path forward for certain sectors and uses. And those are the technology transition regulations, which is where EPA will set specific GWP limits for a given end use or sector. So for example, setting a 150 global warming potential limit for supermarket systems, as California did. A number of petitions were submitted by my organization, other NGOs, as well as states and industry, asking EPA to implement these regulations, and we expect a proposed rulemaking to come out sometime this summer. The third area, and this is perhaps the biggest and most important in my opinion, is life cycle management. And this is where we really need a comprehensive set of rules to control every stage of the life cycle use of these gases. And EPA is indeed given quite broad authority by the AIM Act, and we hope to see a rulemaking come out in the next year. But there's a lot of advocacy yet to be done here to prioritize this. Next slide. And I think that's it for the introduction. So I'm going to hand it back over to Michael, and I'll chime in and Tilden to start going into some of the solutions to the problem.
Before we go on, can you just give a little context? You said 150 max for supermarkets, and what would a typical supermarket be using now anyway? What would a GWP for a supermarket refrigerant be?
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk more about this, but your typical supermarket might be using an HFC with a GWP of 4,000. Whereas if you were under 150, the solutions available are really almost 0. There's carbon dioxide, which has a global warming potential of 1, ammonia, which is 0, and hydrocarbons, which are, 2 or 3, depending on how you measure it. So they're very low. We call them the ultra low GWP solutions.
Okay, very good. Well, Christina, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to start out by talking about appliances, and it's just a small part of the refrigerants picture is appliances. Refrigerators, freezers, air conditioners, dehumidifiers. They contain relatively small amounts of refrigerants and are dispersed widely among citizens who only rarely need to know how to recycle them. In looking at this picture, let's first note that although the appliances seem to have been thrown around and are stored outside at the mercy of the elements, they most likely all still have their refrigerants intact because they are all factory sealed units. And we'll be mentioning this business about factory sealed units again later this evening. The refrigerants they hold are extremely intense greenhouse gases. So if we can capture and reclaim the refrigerants from just 5 window air conditioners, it prevents emissions equivalent to driving a car 11,000 miles at a measly 22 miles per gallon. And in New York State, appliance recycling is different in each county. And in some counties, the townships are responsible for this. Yet, Most appliance recycling programs were started in the 1990s, in a day when everyone believed the scientists about the problems with stratospheric ozone. Only a few municipal programs were created with climate crisis in mind. For example, where I live, Orange County charges $15 to recycle an appliance with refrigerants. That's a fee that's turned over to the company that captures the refrigerants and takes them for reclamation. The appliances are accepted at 3 transfer stations around the county, so the owner must feel it is important enough that they will schlep their appliance to the transfer station and shell out the $15. I want everyone to know that throughout New York, all of the utilities will pay you $25 or $50 or more for an old working refrigerator. They all outsource this work to a company called ARCA, which really does top-notch recycling. So that's clearly the best way to recycle a working refrigerator. But only about 5% of refrigerators in Orange County are recycled that way. Another 5% are schlepped to the transfer stations and recycled, which gives us the 10% recycling rate that I've mentioned here. So if everyone who's concerned about the climate crisis knew the importance of this recycling, would the recycling rate be higher? The measures taken to address ozone depletion are working, but we need to rethink and upgrade appliance recycling programs for them to become part of the solution to the climate crisis. So New Yorkers for Cool Refrigerant Management is looking for partners to work with on coolest recycling drives. In 2020, the Bard College Office of Sustainability received a grant to do a refrigerants management project. Among other things, they conducted an appliance recycling drive that was free to the public. And from this drive, we learned that the scrap metal in the appliances can be sold to cover the costs of a recycling drive. Also, Bard used some grant money to buy the equipment necessary to do this work, plus a wonderful retired HVAC expert and gentleman who is with us this evening, Denny there, has agreed to train interns to do the work. And we plan to recruit interns who have their EPA certification to handle refrigerants, but who still lack the hands-on experience to really know the work. In short, working with Bard College, we will be able to offer a service team that will capture refrigerants from appliances at no cost to a hosting organization, such as another university, a nonprofit group, or perhaps a climate smart communities task force. Ideal partners would be able to organize drop-off events and pickup truck brigades, as well as publicize these events. They could also network with student or community groups, such as a Lions Club or Rotary Club, to broaden the reach of the event. We believe the Coolest Recycling campaign overcomes the barriers to proper recycling. People don't know how important this recycling is. Well, publicity for the Coolest Recycling events will provide the information. Challenges schlepping appliances where they need to go? A volunteer pickup truck brigade will collect the appliances. Don't want to pay the 15 or 20 bucks? Well, there's no fee for anyone to recycle their appliance, but donations will be gladly accepted. And then we have a few big picture solutions, and I'm going to ask Christina and Tilden to help me out with these.
Yeah, so, I think we really do need some policies in place here to make it easier for folks, and also to make sure the right incentives are in place. Certainly, something called an extended producer responsibility program, which some may be familiar with from plastics and other types of waste, could go a long way to providing some funding that will allow regulators and to put in place the right incentives to do this, where essentially industry members in the supply chain would contribute to a fund using there would be a fee on the sale of refrigerants that could help fund incentives for the recovery, the reclamation, and all these costs associated with the proper recycling and disposal of the gases. And another thing is, all of us can be making sure that when we are buying new appliances, we are looking for the ones that don't contain them. They are available in many places, even where they're not, not mandatory. And so this is a great website, climatefriendlycooling.com, where you can go and find more information about available fridges and other types of household appliances that don't contain HFCs.
As far as EPRs, I think of two that are possibly relevant here. One is to do one on appliances, just for the appliances, because it's sort of a separate waste stream. And the other is when contractors are out in the field, and we'll talk about that more later, and they need incentive to make sure they're collecting all they can. And New York City actually has an EPR program for appliances. And that there's definitely a project out there for someone to find a way to just get that publicized better, because it's very underutilized. And the number of people who would be utilizing if they knew about it would just be many, many times more than what's actually going on.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think most people in New York City have no idea that there's a service where they can put their fridge out on the sidewalk and have somebody come and properly recover this super greenhouse gas from it and actually make sure it's disposed of properly or reclaimed. And I think that we have a new administration in New York City coming in, and perhaps they might be open to new and fresh ideas for how they can increase their impact. It's a good time to talk to the city about this program.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. I think Tilden's going to share next and show some slides. But the one follow-up I want to say, there's a brochure on there. We do have a brochure that I've written up for the town of Warwick, where I live. And there's two versions of it. One is the county recycling coordinator switched to his language. But if you would like to take my brochure and customize it for your town, you have to change, well, what is the utility number you have to call if you get your refrigerator hauled away, and how much are they paying now? And what's the address of the drop-off location and how much you have to pay? You have to change a few details, but it's ready to go. And it's the subtitle of the brochure is Steal This Brochure. So if you have any interest in publishing such a brochure, please contact me.
Great. Well, thanks, Michael and Christina, and thanks to all for being here. At this point in our talk, I'd like to point out something that has really changed the way that I view this work on refrigerant management. We have known ways of preventing refrigerant leaks in operating equipment and methods and strategies to capture refrigerant gases from appliances at end of life. We talked about that with the coolest recycling drives. So here's the kicker that really gets me. With these tools, if implemented fully, no molecule of refrigerant once created should ever see the atmosphere. And I'll say it again, no molecule of refrigerant once created should ever see the atmosphere. So this chart from EIA shows what a closed loop life cycle looks like for refrigerant gases. And I've marked two key steps here. The first is where we recover the refrigerant, and that's a critical opportunity to prevent that refrigerant from entering the atmosphere. And the second is a little bit downstream, where we're able to reuse and clean up the used gas, which is a process known as reclaim. And we can restore used refrigerant gas to the same quality as virgin refrigerant gas and sell it back to consumers. And this life cycle is just one component of the circular economy, but for refrigerant gases. Now, to date, refrigerant reclaim rates, again, the percentage of used gas that we're able to actually clean up and sell again, remain low, around 31%. And although a small slice of refrigerant available for recovery actually ends up being destroyed, meaning it never will reach the atmosphere, the majority is this red curve, which is simply released into the atmosphere. This is a practice known as refrigerant venting, which is an illegal practice prohibited by the Section 608 rules from the EPA. And refrigerant venting is most common in the recovery and collection phase of refrigerant management. And the highest impact is for small appliances, such as air conditioners and refrigerators. And there are a couple of reasons for this, but one of them is that there are fewer reporting requirements attached to these small appliances under the Clean Air Act compared with big appliances that contain more refrigerant. So there are a couple of ways of thinking about refrigerant venting, but one of them is just a pretty large negative externality. Basically, people are releasing this gas into the atmosphere, which causes global climate change. And these emissions are non-trivial. In fact, we kind of ran the numbers and we found that estimated emissions from venting refrigerant each year is equivalent to about annual emissions from about 4.2 million cars. Again, at 11,000 miles per year, 22 miles per gallon.
That's a national number, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So beyond reducing negative externalities in the present, there are a couple other strong policy arguments for refrigerant reclaim. And the first one is subtle. Reclaim reduces demand for new virgin refrigerant. So let's, for a moment, take a step back and think about other materials that we can reuse and recycle. Maybe let's take plastics. The more plastics that we reuse, the less new plastic we need to manufacture, and the less plastic overall ends up in the landfill. And the same is true for refrigerant gases. The more existing gas that we can clean up and reuse, the less new gas we need to manufacture, and the less refrigerant overall ends up in the atmosphere. Christina mentioned that preventing new production of HFC is a key goal in HFC mitigation efforts. So many of us policy nerds are also really excited about refrigerant reclaim because it can accelerate the existing phase down of HFC under the AIM Act that Christina outlined. So if there's lower demand than expected for new virgin refrigerant, policymakers can make the case to accelerate the phase down of HFCs, preventing a large amount of emissions in the process. But unfortunately, refrigerant reclaim isn't quite happening fast enough, at least not yet. And one reason is because of historical market dynamics. The cost of newly producing refrigerant has been lower than the cost of reclaiming it. And there are also problems with getting enough used recovered refrigerant back to reclaim companies. And many point to illegal refrigerant venting as a problem. So there are a couple policy approaches that we can use here. And the first is to generate technician incentives to recover more refrigerant. I'll note that many contractors today who go out and service equipment and recover refrigerant inside face substantial barriers to recovering refrigerant responsibly because they may face high transport costs or opportunity costs, the time it takes for them to actually go and recover refrigerant. And imagining new ways to incentivize these technicians and contractors to do the right thing could be a key boost to refrigerant reclaim. These incentives should also be targeted toward the technicians or contractors who bear the largest financial burdens of recovery, who are often solar contractors out in the field. The next, we alluded to a few slides back, but it's called extended producer responsibility. And as a reminder, this is a policy that places the financial and or physical responsibility for the disposal and recycling of products on manufacturers themselves. So in this case, chemical manufacturers or original equipment manufacturers, both of which have specialized knowledge about the products that they've sold, would take responsibility for the disposal of the appliances that they sell. And lastly, we can do a better job of scaling up known technology for capturing, reclaiming, and destroying refrigerant gases. Many HFCs today are a blend of different types of other refrigerants, including other HFCs. And when they arrive at a refrigerant reclaim facility, they're contaminated with oils, lubricants, and grime. This dirty and chemically blended refrigerant often requires companies to have specialized technology to clean up the refrigerant, including fractional distillation, to actually reclaim the gas and be able to sell it again. And today, only the largest refrigerant reclaimers have access to this technology, which imperils the effectiveness of some reclaimers that are mom and pop stores that just reclaim refrigerant gas. So I'll pause here and pass it on to Michael.
Thanks, Tilden. In our next phase, we're going to talk about heat pumps. And this is a very specific application of what Tilden just talked about related to the problems with reclaim. As everyone here tonight knows, most homes in New York are heated by burning fossil fuels, and this generates about 1/3 of our emissions from combustion. Switching this heat over to cleanly generated electricity is a critical aspect of New York reaching its climate goals. Beneficial electrification discussions rarely include the potential offsetting role of refrigerants in heat pumps. If we look closely, we can see where we face the biggest risks that could potentially offset the important work of switching to clean heating. There are significant differences between ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps. This table, which describes residential heat pumps, lists a few of the differences. Ground source heat pumps last longer, and they use 30 to 40% less electricity on an annual basis than air source heat pumps. While both use the same kind of refrigerant, R410A, air source heat pumps use 3 to 4 times as much as ground source heat pumps use. And moreover, air source heat pumps are much more prone to leaks than ground source heat pumps. In this presentation, I'm assuming a 1% annual leak rate for ground source heat pumps and a 4% annual leak rate for air source heat pumps. Why do I assume these? Well, in many cases, the ground source heat pump is, the refrigerant in a ground source heat pump is contained in factory sealed units, like we mentioned before about the appliances. And also, in many cases, but not always, the air source heat pumps require HVAC contractors to make 4 flawless flare fittings on site for each indoor unit. And this is what I'm talking about. We can see in this picture 2 of those flare fittings, and they're crafted on site, and they need to hold fairly high PSIs through great temperature extremes over 15 years. And here's a picture of a leak that was detected in my home. This leak did not show up at 350 PSI, but it did show up at 700 PSI. From what we understand, California is about to publish a study that showed that the air source heat pumps leaked at about 4%. I thought that ground source heat pumps, and this is not all ground source heat pumps, but the one that are factory sealed units, I thought a reasonable annual leak rate is 1%. Christina or Tilden, do either of you want to comment on those leak rates?
Yeah, Michael, I mean, I think one thing I'd like to say about this is it's difficult to come by accurate data on leak rates. So these are estimates. This California study that you've mentioned, hopefully coming out soon, may give us some good representative data. But what we're talking about often with a residential system is if it's leaking, if it springs a leak, in many cases, it might be a catastrophic leak, and you could actually leak 100% from your individual heat pump. So we're averaging here to come up with an estimate, but what you should know is if the whole amount of refrigerant comes out of your heat pump, it really could be offsetting a lot of the effort that you've made to adopt the technology to reduce your emissions on an individual basis. And so thinking of it that way too, I think is important.
Right, so the 4% leak rate isn't that every heat pump is going to like slowly lose air, like every tire in the country were to lose air at a 4% rate. It's like a couple of them will lose all of their load, and that will average out to 4%. Is that a way to look at it? Or they'll lose half of their load. Some will lose half their load. And is that reasonable?
I think that's a good way to think about it. That's right. And so this is the best guess as to what that average is out to.
Okay, thank you. So in general, we believe refrigerant emissions from air source heat pumps are a much bigger concern than those of ground source heat pumps. But can we get a clear idea of how much the impact is? So I want to thank John Schiavocco of Aztec Geothermal and the New York Geothermal Association, NYGEO, for creating a spreadsheet that helped me compile this slide. He originally did some calculations for a home that used 1,000 gallons of number 2 heating fuel annually. And this home he retrofitted with a ground source heat pump. His spreadsheet calculated how much emissions were reduced by shifting away from fuel oil, and how much losing the whole charge of refrigerant after 25 years would offset that gain. In this case, the refrigerant charge was 5 pounds of R410A. And I want to say, for the numbers presented on the slide, we use 20-year GWPs. We're New Yorkers after all, and that's what we're doing in CLCPA. And we also assumed 100% clean electricity. John also calculated if you sourced your energy from different parts of the state and the grid had different amounts of dirty electricity, how much it would diminish these emission reductions. But later he figured out how much natural gas or propane would have been needed to heat the same house that he picked up, and then what were their offset emissions. And I copied his spreadsheet and modified it to cover what 15 years of reduced emissions would look like if the home had been retrofitted with an air source heat pump instead. And talking to him and a couple of his colleagues, we got the number that if you had done it with air source heat pumps, you would have needed 19 pounds of R410A. So these black circles represent the emissions assuming annual leaks of 1% and a complete loss of refrigerant charge of end of life. In the ground source heat pumps, it's a 14.3 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and that's a lot, but it really is only a small fraction of the emissions that were avoided. But for the air source heat pumps, the result is a little bit disturbing. This represents the 4% annual leak rate plus loss of the complete charge at end of life. It's very common for contractors to vent refrigerants when removing old equipment, but it doesn't have to be that way. If we found the right policies that encouraged every technician to always recover refrigerants at end of life, the refrigerants would only offset a small portion of the emissions avoided. So the draft scoping plan for the CLCPA assumes that by 2030, all new heat pumps will use low GWP refrigerants. And there are several different plans for how many homes can be electrified before 2030. Governor Hochul's State of the State address mentioned having 1 million homes with heat pumps and another 1 million homes ready for heat pumps. One of the scenarios in the draft scoping plan calls for 1.5 million homes with heat pumps by 2030. And a couple of the scenarios call for 1.8 million homes to have heat pumps in that time frame. We believe the switch to heat pumps should go ahead, but before we embark on this road trip in our EVs, let's first look critically at the challenges ahead and make sure we've got all of our tires fully inflated. One challenge will be getting enough skilled workers for this massive project. For at least 10 years, there's been a shortage of new entries in the skilled trades, and they're really going to need to ramp up the workforce. Another culture and another challenge, and this has been pointed out by Dave Conover of Sustainable Hudson Valley, who's with us tonight, there's the potential for whole segments of the population to revolt at being told they can't replace their old furnace with a new one that burns the same fuel. And lastly, the integration analysis for the CLCPA assumes that we'll have a 90% recovery rate. Now, this is an extremely lofty and important goal, and it's one we should start working toward as soon as possible. And we have a number of policy solutions, and again, I'm going to ask Christina and Tilden to help me out with this list. But I want to start out on the first one, emphasize factory sealed units when possible. It's just I guess it's the design. If it's sealed, then if it's sealed in, there's certain design choices about how you're going to heat and cool your home, and a lot of times they will take a lot of things into calculation, but they won't think about what refrigerant emissions might be. So the factory sealed units just have this really powerful advantage if that becomes taken into consideration. Christina and Tilden, got some other ideas about this?
Well, I'll tell you, a lot of they say, the best offense is a good defense. I'll say when it comes to leaks, good installation of a heat pump can really help prevent a lot of problems later on. And so if we could really set uniform best practices around how these units are installed and tested for leak tightness at the beginning of their lifetime, I think we could avoid a lot of these leaks. So that means, of course, not only developing those common best practices for servicing technicians to follow, but making sure they're trained properly in those best practices and that there can be some kind of verification or enforcement that those things are happening. So we should be thinking, of course, about how our building codes can play into that. And that's really important to consider. Of course, we also need the next generation of refrigerants to put in this equipment. At the moment, the best technologies available to us and just becoming available here for refrigerants have global warming potentials that are still almost 750 times carbon dioxide. Of course, that's a lot better than the ones we're using right now, which have 2000 GWP. So it's about a 60% improvement, but it's still not consistent with our climate goals by mid-century. We're not going to achieve what we're trying to achieve if we're installing new pieces of equipment that last 15 to 20 years that still have super greenhouse gases in them. So we need to absolutely fast track the development and availability of equipment using ultra low GWP refrigerants. Super important. These substances exist, and we really just need to fast track their development and deployment onto the market. They're available in some cases already in other markets in Europe and Asia, but have unfortunately been slow to be introduced here in the United States.
And the last thing is to boost end-of-life reclaim rates and to transform current culture. It's something that I talked about a few slides back, but just trying to focus on end-of-life management for this equipment is really crucial. And just to add on to what Christina was saying about new generation refrigerants, I know this was a question for my family this past year when we were trying to look for a heat pump, but there's a list of climate-friendly or the best available options so far, and it's being updated. Heat pumps, air conditioners, refrigerators, other household HVAC equipment. That's on climatefriendlycooling.com, and we'll circulate that link afterward. So that
I'm going to stop sharing and let Tilden pull up his share screen. But while he's doing that, I want to mention we learned yesterday about a new program being launched by NYSERDA with VEIC, where it'll be a 3-year program where they'll actually be developing like a higher standard for leak smart, leak tight installations. And if you're involved with like a heat smart program or anything like that, contact us and we will help you get in contact with that program. And now on to Tilden and his review of grocery stores.
Thanks, Michael. Unsurprisingly, grocery stores are a really large source of refrigerant emissions. According to EPA estimates, HFC emissions from a single grocery store in America are equivalent to annual emissions from 340 cars, which we might imagine as the store's whole parking lot. I'd also note that this figure that I just cited excludes refrigerant emissions that occur elsewhere in a supermarket supply chain, such as from refrigerated trucks that transport food or from food storage and distribution warehouses elsewhere in town. Now, let's hone in on the largest food retailer in America, Walmart, for a moment. And over the past decade, we can see Walmart's HFC emissions, which they report to the public. And we see that HFC emissions have stayed steady. And if anything, they've risen since 2010 levels. The emissions from all of Walmart's stores are staggering. More than 3 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is about 60% of Walmart's scope 1 emissions, are coming from HFC. We can also observe that HFC intensity, which I measured as HFC emissions per million square feet of retail floor, haven't fallen either. In other words, we can't point to franchise expansion alone as the cause of stable or rising HFC emissions. It looks like Walmart just hasn't really been decarbonizing their refrigeration. I will note that Walmart actually committed to phase down HFCs starting in 2015 in 2010 through a pledge to the Consumer Goods Forum. But clearly they haven't made much progress on this since. So now we'll take a step back and look kind of at a high level at New York State. And a few weeks ago, Michael and I flipped through New York's latest HFC emissions and greenhouse gas reporting documents. And we found that in 2019, refrigerant emissions from commercial refrigeration, also known as supermarkets and convenience stores, was a quarter of all statewide HFC emissions and 1.4% of all statewide greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that we can reduce these emissions by reducing leak rates, by transitioning away from HFCs, and by capturing refrigerant at end of life. So cutting these emissions, which are 1.4% of our whole state greenhouse gas inventory, seems like pretty low-hanging fruit. There are some challenges, though, because HFC continues to be used widely across the state. And also, it's been cheaper to refill lost refrigerant gas than to repair the leaks that cause us or supermarkets to lose gas in the first place. So there's still a lot more to do. And maybe with the HFC phase down hitting the country right now, that will change. There are other things that we should just note about the entire country, which is that according to the EPA, average leak rates from supermarket refrigerators are expected to be as high as 25% on average per year. And the consequences of these leaks aren't just fugitive refrigerant emissions, but also lower energy efficiency, since equipment operating on suboptimal refrigerant charge uses more electricity to generate the same cooling. This suggests that refrigerant leakage is the cause of scope 1 refrigerant emissions, but also scope 2 emissions from purchased electricity. And I'll also note that some companies are doing a great job, some food retailers are doing a great job of adopting low GWP equipment, such as Aldi and Target. But action isn't quite fast enough, and these stores are only a fraction of the food retail market. And especially, we're worried about independent grocery stores, which will need special help doing the climate-friendly thing, which is to transition away from HFC. These independent grocers often don't have the same access to capital, or they have fewer technical resources compared with the big food retailers. And this is a barrier to them purchasing and installing new climate-friendly equipment. So let's talk solutions for a moment. There are some pretty clear solutions to reducing refrigerant emissions in grocery stores. First, we can create incentives for grocery stores to install leak detection equipment that notifies technicians if refrigerant is leaking into the atmosphere from equipment inside the store. And this technology is a sensible investment. It prevents unnecessary costs for refrigerant recharge and equipment repair, and it's good for the environment. And we can note that one such program that recognizes franchises with low leak rates and/or climate-friendly refrigerants is the Green Chill program at the EPA. I also get really excited about grocery stores and refrigerants because there's a lot that we can do as citizens that we can do to help. And I remember as a high school student, I was always looking for things that I could do, and this is one of them. First, we can recognize the amazing work that EIA has been doing to raise awareness about HFCs and lagging corporate actions to mitigate emissions. I'll point to a couple of sources here. The first is called Leaking Havoc, which is a report published by EIA, in which EIA advocates went undercover in the DC area with refrigerant leak detectors to find leaks in supermarkets. And in fact, EIA found that 60% of Walmart stores were leaking refrigerant into the atmosphere. More than half of stores more broadly had a refrigerant leak. This was also published in the Washington Post. Second, EIA has also been a leader in creating shareholder resolutions that urge companies to adopt HFC-free technology and to set strong targets for reducing leaks and emissions. And one such project is a petition to get Trader Joe's to commit to more robust sustainability and labor standards. And at the top of this list of demands are HFCs. And you can sign that petition from the link that we'll distribute later. Lastly, this is a project that I'm really excited about, but EIA has a climate-friendly supermarkets tool, which first tells us which supermarkets are, according to best available data, are doing the best in phasing out HFCs in their stores and also doing the best at reducing leaks. And it also collects crowdsourced data on which grocery stores in the country are using climate-friendly refrigerant. We'll show you that in a second. And we'll also circulate a link after this webinar so you can see how to participate for yourself. Me and many other volunteers at New Yorkers for Cool Refrigerant Management have loved to do this ourselves, and it's very fun. But here's a map, and Christina can jump in too. But this is crowdsourced data on HFC use in grocery stores, and there's a whole map for the whole world, but this is just New York State. And we'll just pick out the red dots and the green dots for now. The green dots represent a store using that doesn't use HFCs or is certified by the EPA. It's Green Chill Platinum that rewards very low leak rates or use of HFC-free technology. And the red dots are where HFCs or the ozone depleting HCFCs are the only refrigerants used in the store. And you can see that there's some pretty big red hot spots in New York, but also a fair number of green dots up near Rochester. That's where Wegmans has a lot of stores that are using HFC-free technology. And you can submit your stores in your area at climatefriendlysupermarkets.org.
Yeah, and a big shout out.
Yeah.
Just looking at this map that Tilden just had up, these points on the map are not sourced from some database. These are people going out to their grocery stores in their neighborhood and seeing what they use and sending us pictures of the refrigerant label, and us then using that to categorize this and present it on a map so that everybody can go and see, oh, there's a climate-friendly green store near me, I could choose to shop there, or I know this company is doing better at adopting HFC-free technologies than another, for instance, in my area. So it's, I think, really powerful to see the participation that we're getting in this, and it's just a real shout out to all the folks in New York that have been contributing to this. It's been great to see, and you know, we're going to continue to use this data in different ways to really advocate with these companies at the corporate level for how consumers are really getting more and more interested in this and paying attention to what they're doing. So thanks for everyone who's participating, and really encourage folks to go and take part in this and keep up the good work.
Great, thanks, Christina. And we'll pass it back to Michael.
Okay, and actually, this next section is also for Christina to introduce. She's the hockey rink expert, among other expertises, whatever.
This is something that I'm really passionate about, and a recent piece of work that we've done on these refrigerants, looking at ice rinks, which are, you know, not necessarily the biggest source of HFCs, because actually, interestingly enough, our ice rinks have been using climate-friendly technologies for a long time. Ammonia, which has a 0 global warming potential, has been really commonly used in ice rinks, which is great. It's one of the places where we've been using the solutions already in a lot of cases. And so we were quite disturbed and troubled when we learned that actually the National Hockey League had entered into a paid marketing deal with Chemours, which is one of the major HFC producers, to promote HFCs that are mixed with HFOs as sustainable alternatives in ice hockey rinks, and really go out and promote those as green technologies to communities around the country. You know, these substances that they're marketing have global warming potentials of between 1,000 to 3,000 on a 20-year timescale, and yet they're being labeled as low GWP. So of course, in comparison to something with a 0 GWP, replacing it with that actually makes the problem a lot worse. So this is something it's an example of what we think is climate misinformation and greenwashing. And we'd really like your help to send a message to the National Hockey League, asking them to take action to stop promoting HFCs and actually really support the alternatives that are already being used in most of the NHL rinks, such as ammonia and also CO2. So anyone who's interested in that, please go ahead and find this link later, and we'll send it out to you, and you can support us in sort of stopping the spread of this greenwashing platform. And other solutions on hockey rinks, of course, we can actually implement policies similar to supermarkets to ban the use of HFCs when we're installing new refrigeration systems. And since many hockey rinks are community owned, we can really engage at the local level in our towns to ensure we aren't adopting these HFC, HFO blends. We can also seek out grants and incentive programs. A great example just happened here in the Hudson Valley, where the town of Saugerties was awarded a Climate Smart Community grant to install an ammonia system, which is great to see. And this is just showing, we have a little infographic here that, you know, if all of the ice rinks in North America were to install this HFC instead of ammonia, it would be the equivalent of adding 15 coal-fired power plants. So not nothing for what it's worth, and really something we should be paying attention to.
Very good. This refrigerator, which is still in use from the 1990s, 5.5 ounces of a refrigerant with a 20-year GWP of 11,000. Now, if we were to capture just a pound of that refrigerant, again, it would be the equivalent of taking the average car off the road for a year. Now, while capturing that refrigerant would reduce emissions that cause climate change, even if we captured tons and tons, it would not make a bit of difference in our greenhouse gas inventory. How can that be? Could it be because of the beautiful drawings from the granddaughter on the refrigerator? Christina, can you step in here a second and help us out answering this question?
The question is,
how could it be that the the R12 in this doesn't count toward our greenhouse gas inventory.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. So when we developed the categories of greenhouse gases under the Kyoto Protocol and the UN framework, R12 was an ozone depleting substance. It was considered something taken care of by the Montreal Protocol and not something that we needed to focus on as a greenhouse gas. And so as a result, in a lot of our greenhouse gas accounting, we haven't included these gases, even though they are some of the most potent greenhouse gases around. So this is really something we should be looking at. In fact, it's why the Montreal Protocol is considered secretly to be the most successful climate treaty in the world already by going a long way towards phasing out the new production of these gases. But they are still around as little climate bombs sitting in our kitchens and in our basements in these old fridges.
So in the last couple of months, with the publication of the CLCPA and the first statewide greenhouse gas inventory using the CLCPA way of doing things, they talked about the ODS, ozone depleting substances. They're so odious, so it's easy to remember their acronym ODS. So they say future reports may provide an estimate of what these emissions are once there is sufficient information to estimate emissions at the state level. And this is from the part of the report, the statewide greenhouse gas report that had to do with industrial process and product use, which was where all of the refrigerants were found. Well, we have a reasonable way to estimate those emissions. The United States Greenhouse Gas Inventory includes data about HCFC and CFC emissions, but it provides it in metric tons of emissions, not in CO2 equivalent. So what we did was we converted the ODSs to CO2 equivalent using 20-year GWPs and compared it to the amount of HFC emissions reported in the same nationwide inventory, also using 20-year GWPs. And we found that for every 100 tons of HFCs, there would be an additional 73 tons of HCFC emissions and 18 tons of CFC emissions. So this is the greenhouse gas inventory for New York State for 2019 as calculated for the CLCPA. And again, it's using 20-year GWPs, plus it also accounts upstream emissions. And if CFCs and HCFCs were also counted, it would increase the whole inventory by 5% to 398 million megatons of CO2 equivalent, and it would look like this. And refrigerants would comprise 10% of the total. So if you think back about the other things we discussed this evening, things like, well, 1.4% of state emissions just came from grocery stores. That doesn't account for the HCFCs that are still being used in grocery stores. So everything that we talked about before would be amplified, and especially if we emphasized what Christina talked about, the pillar of stopping leaks and capturing at the end of the life. We've already done the work of transitioning to new refrigerants for the HCFCs and the CFCs. But if we can emphasize this other aspect of refrigerant management, stopping the leaks and capturing at end of life, then it would make a big difference. Not that it would be captured necessarily in a greenhouse gas inventory. So here are the important policies to support regarding ozone depleting substances. Again, Tilden and Christina, can you help me work through this list?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I do in my own work with refrigerants is to help Yale University inventory its refrigerants, meaning go out and find where we use refrigerants and then estimate their leakage into the atmosphere, then translate that into emissions figures that we can go report to the public. And a really important part of this inventory is to not only count the HFCs, which we're required to report by many different greenhouse gas reporting guidelines, but also to count the ozone depleting substances, which we actually use pretty heavily here on campus still. And this means that we're counting every single gas and also reporting what's optional in a lot of these greenhouse gas reporting protocols. So going above and beyond. And I'll pass it to Christina for the rest.
Yeah, and I think, in the past, we have done some destruction and disposal of ozone depleting substances, but it's relied a lot on voluntary credit markets for offsets. Of course, offsets are not ideal for many reasons, that they allow pollution, climate pollution, to continue elsewhere, but they're also hard to verify and can be kind of a perverse incentive to actually produce more of something if you get paid to destroy it. So the offset market, as it says here, is far from ideal, and extended producer responsibility programs would be considered a much better way to approach the problem. And these kind of schemes are already in place in some other countries around the world, and already seeing better results than we have here, and that includes in Canada and Australia.
I sometimes have wanted to look up, I just haven't gotten around to it, but how much money, the same companies that are selling refrigerants to us here in the United States have been required to dedicate how much money to those EPR programs in Canada and Australia? And how come, we haven't had that resource available to us? In the circular design that Tilden was showing us earlier, one of the things is you've got to, at a certain point, you want to destroy some of the refrigerants. And we hear often again that some contractor took his refrigerant in, and then this distributor said, oh, that was mixed refrigerant, we can't do anything, and we've got to charge you $200 for bringing us that stuff. And or sometimes the reclaimers can't do anything with the refrigerant, and they will, they know they've got to take it to be destroyed, but it's just an expense. They sort of let it sitting in tanks and sort of hoping that it maybe solves itself by disappearing into the atmosphere. Well, if we had the money that Canada and Australia were collecting, those sort of problems wouldn't be here.
That's right. It's like turning a game of hot potato where everyone's trying to get rid of the thing, to changing it into like a bag of cash that you want to that has value, and you want to safeguard it to get it to the right place so that you can, collect that rebate or collect that incentive. Making it a thing of value would be probably the most effective way to change actual behavior and market trends.
Right. So I saw in Canada, they covered the cost of destroying it, but sometimes it wasn't necessarily true that they were paying people to bring it in. So at least there was no financial burden for the person who did bring it in and do the right thing. And that way there also wasn't the perverse incentive that you talked about of, bringing in something so then you could go and produce more and have more to sell to this market.
Yeah, that's right. You can actually positively benefit from doing the right thing instead of it being a cost to you, which I think is so important.
And then I guess the last item on this list, there are consumers and companies, if you own equipment with CFCs and HFCs, there are many reasons to upgrade, including energy efficiency and greenhouse gas liabilities, and the fact that HCFCs especially are becoming really expensive nowadays. And so if you need any slight amount to repair, you really should think about upgrading. And hopefully you can find a climate-friendly refrigerant for however you upgrade. And we have compiled a resource sheet for taking action. And we promise to email it out to everyone who signed up for the webinar. And we also encourage you to check out our website and to email us if you have any questions about this or any of the questions in the solutions list that we'll be emailing out. And at this point, I'm going to give you our contact information. And we're going to open the floor for questions.
There might be a couple in the chat, Michael, just FYI.
There's one question about what is holding up the availability of the new generation of refrigerants in the US. And I think that's a really good question when it comes to the heat pumps. When I mentioned they're available in Europe and some other countries around the world. It's a bit of a complex answer, but the simple one is that in many cases, there are building codes and standards that prevent the uptake of refrigerants that require updating to put in place the right kind of safety standards for using these refrigerants. And in many cases, there's competition between the industry producing HFCs and the other refrigerants that they don't produce. And so I think placing more pressure on the industry to update these standards and building codes is really important to seeing this happen in the US.
I see Mana Joe has a question. New York State is pushing air and ground source heat pumps. How much of a contribution do these very potent refrigerants cause now and into the future?
I have another question, and that is, do you have sample codes that counties and towns and cities, municipalities, can put into place to replace the outdated ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are some codes that exist that could be replicated. Most of the time, these codes, building codes in the US are often adopted at the state level. And so the most impactful thing would be for the state to revise its entire code for the state. Not to say that it wouldn't be great for this to happen at the local level, and it's quite possible. But of course, to bring the market for these products to the United States, it needs to be a scaled up market and sort of not, little dots of the right building codes in the right place. But I think it's something that's an interesting question to think about, whether local level action on codes could be an effective way to move the needle.
If I may, often what is adopted at a local level becomes state law. It can be sort of technology forcing, but I'm wondering if there's a way to think about how much leakage is currently going on with the highly potent refrigerants that are in the air and ground source heat pumps, and also over time, because do people know to maybe annually have somebody come and check the pressure and be sure there are no leaks, etc. I'm very worried about it because it's being pushed so widely statewide with incentives and so forth, beneficial electrification. And the other half of that is getting the renewables with storage in place to power the beneficial electrification. But I'm in the process of trying to sort that out, and because my boiler went down and I have to make a decision. And they say environmentally friendly refrigerants, and do we really have a list so that I can check whether or not it is?
Sometimes I've heard people say environmentally friendly because it's not an ozone depleting substance.
Yeah. So if there is a source of clear information, I would share that with Cornell Cooperative Extension in this area is doing a lot of advising around air and ground source heat pumps. And I would be sure to pass that on to them.
A quick plug, next Wednesday, 3:50 NYC, Christina is going to be speaking at our local solutions meeting. And hopefully we'll discuss some of the opportunities we have now in New York City to strengthen the law, the EPR law about picking up and disposing of hydrofluorocarbons from appliances. And if there are people on this call, I'm going to put my email in the chat, but if there are people from New York City, I mean, you can join 350 NYC from anywhere, it's a Zoom. But we do want to work more on the city legislation. And the good news is, I put it in the chat, but the new head of sanitation in the city is a councilwoman called Sandy Nurse. Some of you may know of her, and she is phenomenal, and she will take no prisoners. So we're very, very hopeful that she'll be very interested in the HFC question.
That's great, Margaret. I'm really looking forward to that conversation next week.
Back to Manajo's question about how much contribution do they make from ground source and air source heat pump. I'm still pretty sure that at this point, it's not such a large slice, but of course it's growing. However, I think the two biggest slices of refrigerant emissions in New York State, one is the grocery stores and the other is residential heating systems. So air conditioning systems. And the main thing is, people, the contractors know that they're supposed to capture the refrigerant, but it's just not in the culture that most of them do it. If that was turned around, then things would be different. And one of the things that I think would be helpful for this that we haven't discussed so much before is transparency. So we were talking about BEC launching, developing a new leak tight best practices standard. So it seemed to me, so someone gets certified as being able to follow these standards, but part of the certification should be that every year they're going to publicize how much refrigerant they have captured in their HVAC work. I mean, sometimes you show up at a place and you're taking out an old air conditioning system while you're putting in a new heat pump, and it actually is flat. But sometimes you show up and instead of doing the work of capturing it, you let it all go. And when people ask you, you say, oh, it was flat when we got here. And so part of being somebody who can, one of the contractors who can give you the discounts for getting your heat pump installed, it would be that you have to know the leak tight and follow the leak tight instructions, the verifiable measures that they're taken, but also you've got to publish how much refrigerant are you capturing every year. I was listening to a podcast not long ago that I shared with Tilden, where this guy had went to talk to an HVAC team. The boss wanted him to talk to the people out in the field about how they were doing. And he says, you know, you guys are leaving a lot of money on the table because we're paying you a little bit to bring in this R22. And you 25 guys brought in 17 pounds of refrigerant. He's like, that's just like, you know, you could be they do different things different days, but clearly it's not in their culture to do it. And so the whole culture of the people working on it and what they think about it and financial incentives, it's got to change.
Looks like there's a couple more questions in the chat. One about air source heat pumps. Are they better at containing refrigerants than older central AC condensers? Anybody have a shot at that?
Not good enough would be a good answer. So nobody has invented a heat pump that is totally leak proof. And I don't think it's a big enough focus that they be designed to minimize leaks. And I don't think we have the right incentives in place to, for example, you know, Michael showed that ground source heat pumps use so much less refrigerant than air source heat pumps. Well, you can also design air source heat pumps to use less refrigerant, some less than others, even if they are air source. So they're not one size fits all. So, you know, there's also things we can be doing to make sure to incentivize design of these refrigerants, of these equipment, so they use less refrigerant for a given amount of cooling or heating that they deliver. So, you know, that can really play a role, I think, too. But no, I don't think they're better or worse. And old ACs are notoriously bad as well. So another question here is, can you retrofit an existing heat pump using 410A with a lower GWP refrigerant? And this is a good question. I think right now there really are not what we'd call drop-in alternatives to HFC 410A. That might be true in the future, but the truth is that those drop-ins are going to be maybe incrementally better than what we're using now. One of the reasons is that as you get to lower GWPs, the properties of the refrigerants change pretty significantly, whether it's either the operating pressure, some of them have flammability that you have to manage. So you really need to design a piece of equipment that is intended to be used rather than doing a retrofit. And it's not going to be, unfortunately, a very good strategy, which is why, you know, it's so important that we figure out ways to control the emissions, as well as begin quickly to adopt, you know, new refrigerants when we're installing new equipment.
It looks like the last question on the chat list that I see is, does the AIM Act serve to drive up the cost/value of refrigerants captured?
Well, R22 has certainly shot up because it's when, it's the supply has dropped. But that wasn't the AIM Act. But so there are other things that have driven up the price of HFCs, having to do with Chinese imports being extremely cheap until there was an international trade case that was settled, and they said they were actually dumping, and so that's one thing that's contributed to the HFC price rise. But am I right, Christina? It would be later on in the process of the phase down that the real price hikes would start to kick in. Is that a good assessment?
Yeah, but not so long. I think we're seeing we should see it happen in the next few years quite considerably. So we actually can look at what happened in Europe, which is several years ahead of the US in implementing the HFC phase down. And prices of HFCs increased by up to 1,300%, which is really incredible, in fact. So, those can really incentivize you to do a better job managing your refrigerants once it becomes that expensive to replace. So that should go a long way towards this, but at the end of the day, we still need to do everything we can to ensure that the recycled refrigerant is available on the market. And if we're not, I don't think we should just let market forces play out, because we've seen with previous ozone depleting phase outs that we need to do more than that to make sure we're really capturing the stuff and make sure the right incentives are in place.
Well, I thought this was a great presentation. Presenters, I don't know if you have any final thoughts that you want to share with folks.
I hope everybody will consider taking a look at the actions and solutions resource that gets sent out after the call. And there's quite a few kind of quick, easy things that people can do to get involved. Sign up for emails and stay tuned, because it's I think it's an exciting time to be working on what is really a relatively unknown and underappreciated, but extremely impactful area of climate action. And thanks to everyone for listening through our somewhat long presentation tonight.
Tilden?
Yeah, thanks again to everyone for joining. I've been working on refrigerants for almost 4 years now, ever since high school. And something that makes me keep coming back is just how interesting it is. You can look at it from whole different angles, from the technical side, from the policy side, also from the people side, thinking about how people have HFCs in their lives every day, and it makes people's lives easier, from cooling their homes to cooling their food. And there are really compelling reasons why the HFC should be at the top of the agenda in terms of climate mitigation, including that we have technologically viable solutions. We know how to fix the problem. It just takes a little inertia to be able to do that. So I'm really excited to continue working on HFCs and to see where we can go with this. And New Yorkers for Cool Refrigerant Management is always a great place to come on Wednesday afternoons. So if any of you are interested in coming to meetings, that'd be great. And you can see me, Michael, and Christina there, as well as other people on this call. And I'll pass it to Michael for the final word.
Oh, actually, one more question for you, Tilden. What is Tilden's major? Someone has raised this question.
I'm an economics major, but I focus on energy and the environment.
So at New Yorkers for Cool Refrigerant Management, one of the things we've been saying is that there's no silver bullet for the climate crisis, but there is silver buckshot. And I think we talked tonight about, several things that if people can get involved in, they can help us, get certain projects done, some things accomplished. So I hope you'll check out our website. If you have any follow-up questions about tonight's presentation, you can email us at nyforcool@gmail.com. And please feel free to keep in touch, and we can always use help with our projects. So please join us if you at all possibly can. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.